Yeah, we back on this shit. New current events. They going after Snoop and Puffy for killing Tupac now. You know that's some bullshit, right? A part of this Black Act shit, right? I'm talking about, like, tell these people what's going on here. What happened?
Man,
I don't even mean to put this motherfucker on blast like that, but I got to.
Tupac was killed by FBI, CIA, conspiring with multiple organizations and other groups that did not like his being. Let's put it like that. And to throw one of those organizations out there, I would say Louis Vuitton.
But anyway, all that child trafficking shit and all of that shit, you feel me? They going to Guantanamo Bay. But anyway, I'm here reading the Oxford Handbook of Jurisprudence and the Philosophy of Law. I left off in the middle of classical natural law theory. I'm gonna go back into it a little bit and restart halfway through it with the 3 introductory points about the tradition of natural law theory. You feel me? But its guiding purpose is to answer the parallel questions of a contentious individual, a group, or group's responsible officer, e.g. a judge. What should I do? What should we decide, promote, or enact? True, these normative questions cannot be answered well without a sound and unblinkered knowledge of the facts about the way that the world works. So good descriptions, general and specific, are needed, but descriptions remains of secondary derivative interest. The dominant concern is with judging for oneself what reasons are good reasons for adopting or rejecting specific kinds of options. Societies and their laws and institutions are therefore to be understood as they would be understood by a participant in the deliberations about whether or not to make the choices of actions, dispositions, institutions, practices, etc., which shape and largely constitute that society's reality and determine its worth or worthlessness. This internal point of view is dominant, and the standards and norms of conduct are never constituted by the facts of convention, custom, or consensus, nor by the fact that the deliberating person accepts them. Art is never derivable from is, save by virtue or some higher, more ultimate premise. Positivism, as we shall see, fails to meet this demand of logic coherently, but everything that positivism reasonably wishes to insist upon is clearly and coherently accommodated in the classical natural law theory. Number 2. The reason why classical natural law theory does not reduce ought to is, whether by deduction or otherwise, is that it debates with pre-scientific superstition and with sophistic reductions of right to might. It got clear about the irreducibility to each other of all 4 kinds of order, to which correspond the 4 kinds of theory. Point 1. Orders are what they are, independently of our thinking, and that is nature, the laws of nature, and correspondingly the natural sciences and metaphysics. Point 2. The order which we can bring into our thinking, and correspondingly the standards and disciplines of logic. Point 3. The order in which we can bring into our deliberating and choosing and acting in the open horizon of our whole life, and correspondingly the standards of morality and the reflective discipline of ethics. Point 4. The order in which we can bring into matter, including our own bodies, subject to our power as a means relatively to specific purposes, and correspondingly countless techniques, crafts, and technologies. Morality and natural law, in the relevant sense of that term, cannot be reduced to or deduced from the principles of natural science or metaphysics, logic, or any craft. Nonetheless, this is point 3, nonetheless, the tradition has a clear understanding that one cannot reasonably affirm the equality of human beings or the universality of the binding force of human rights unless one acknowledges that there is something about the persons which distinguishes them radically from sub-rational creatures, and which, prior to any acknowledgement of status, is intrinsic to the factual reality of every human being, adult, immature, healthy, or disabled. Now, Status is important in society. Most people operate from a negative status, but they don't know that the status is negative. Like, what are some of the status classifications?
I mean, status.
No. You had them written down.
Yes.
Where's that at?
Status is a classification of jurisdiction. So therefore, depending on what jurisdiction you have certain names or titles that give you status claiming that jurisdiction. So some statuses are like citizen, resident, person, individual, so on and so forth. You feel me? So when you're a non-resident, non-person, and your status is domiciling or addressed, which is also another status, which is a type name, address is a status. But when you're domiciled or addressed to a certain jurisdiction, it puts you in a certain status. And then when you are hired by the guides of that government, you become under the same jurisdiction, but at a different status with privileges of expressing the service government's immunity, which is also equal to the people's immunity. But when you're in a state of person, individual, citizen, resident, so on and so forth, you obsolete yourself out of that immunity that the people hold, being that you identify metaphysically as one of these titles or names or attributes
They have you relegated to something like a thing instead of being that.
That are descriptive of you as a noun rather than its verbatory state. You know what I'm saying? So at that point, you don't have the equality of sovereignty as the government that serves you, or said service government that serves the government. Equal, and there go, you know what I'm saying? Your status is either what they do render as stateless, you know, they have those statuses, or whatchamacallit?
Who are the stateless people?
There's other statuses.
Who are the stateless people?
Who are the stateless people?
Yeah.
The stateless people who are the ones who do not identify under the jurisdiction of which they're domiciled or addressed as.
What about their national origin?
So you saying about the national origin of those who don't identify?
Yeah, because remember, we're still talking about status.
Well, it depends on the being that's being in question. Like, if the being is already identified as stateless, they're describing themselves that they have no government backing them, no sovereignty backing them, no group of people that employs a government to oversee them backing them. That means they have no constitution of those group of people in contract with another group of people. There are no treaties of that group of people in contract with another group of people. They're just identifying as their individual person self, which has no ability to go to war with the rest of the world. So they're stateless. You know what I'm saying? But their status, even if they don't claim it, depending on their blood and birthright, is either abandoned or.
It's a buddy of ours asking about the whole reversion of estate process, and it's like, I had to explain to her, like, you're doing it by claiming your status. They trying to get seats, so I'll back that shit. Like, real simple with it, but it's like, do you know what you doing with this or whatever? You know what I mean? Because it's like, you really gotta know what things mean.
I mean, yeah, you being the living man is the said land. If you are indigenous, to the land that you are inheriting from
God.
exactly, which means the estate is you and the aspects of the land, the air, the water that
You want to bring under your dominion if it's not being used properly.
the land, air, the water that you already inherit.
Oh, no.
Inherit through your blood or your birthright.
But yeah, well, we don't know that we're the inheritors of stuff and stuff like that, you feel me?
But there's actual property that has been abandoned
Ain't nobody doing nothing with
that
it. Whole towns.
can be obtained.
They can't blow us up if we work together.
That can be obtained through
I don't know how long this is gonna let me go. But yeah, go ahead.
that can be obtained through a quick claim deed in a reversion of estate. If it's conveyed properly, if there's something that is owned by a said entity that has no existence and sensibility, then that said entity is not vacating or is not occupying the said physical property. That property can be vacant by an inhabitant of this land and taken from said company and reversioned or repossessed or adversely possessed.
Like playing a reverse Uno card.
To the said person that's occupying, if they follow the procedure steps to obtaining property that has been abandoned and then absorbed by an entity that has no real existence, no living or tangible existence. So paperwork and representatives.
Yeah, some of the status stuff is paperwork. But you gotta be able to defend what's on the paper. It's like when you write stuff, write things down, put them together. You gotta have the spirit of what's in the paper. But anyway, we're on the modern natural law tradition. And it goes on to say that modern might here mean contemporary, but virtually all who today are willing to call their own work natural law theory regard themselves as representing and developing the classical tradition. Moreover, they reject the characteristic tenets of that modern tradition which emerges in the 1600s, which self-consciously set aside some of the very elements of the classical tradition that today's new classical theorists esteem most highly. So I shall follow a conventional scholarly view of the modern tradition of natural law theory. And this emerges clearly by 1660, when Samuel Pfuendorf published the Hague and his Elements of Universal Jurisprudence. Characteristic features of this kind of natural law theory can never be studied there, or in Pfuendorf's fuller treatise on the law of nature and the law of nations, or in John Locke's long unpublished questions concerning the law of nature, dating apparently from around 1660 to 1664. Both writers are clearly derivative in some ways from Hugo Groot, and in other ways from Thomas Hobbes. Very tellingly, Pfuendorf prominently describes Hobbes' Deceive, 1642, which anticipates the moral and jurisprudential substance of Hobbes' more famous Leviathan, 1651, as for the most part, extremely acute and sound. Now I done download some of those works. You already know I'm gonna go through and read them because we gotta learn how, how the people in the high circles think, that keep us down and fall into that lower selves so they can disrespect us. And then go back to some higher self shit and enjoy the heaven that they created for themselves on the planet Earth, kind of thing. All the while they flex and shit on you. But you don't know you stink. It stinks. Okay, now. From groups massively influential on the law of war and peace of 1625, Locke and Pufendorf take the well-sounding but quite opaque idea that morality and the law's basic principles are a matter of conformity to rational nature. How this nature is known and why it is normative for anyone, these writers never carefully consider. Such fundamental questions were confronted and answered by Hobbes, but his answers treat our practical reasoning as all in the service of subrational passions, such as fear of death and the desire to surpass others, motivations of the very kind identified by the classical tradition as in need of direction by our reasons grasp of the more ultimate and better ends, of true and intrinsic goods, or of really intelligent reasons for action. Hobbes proclaims his contempt for the classical search for the ultimate ends or intrinsic reasons for action. See, gotta read that over. Hobbes proclaims his contempt for the classical search for the ultimate ends or intrinsic reasons for action. Accordingly, there can be for him no question of finding the source of obligation and law in the kind of necessity we identify when we notice that some specific means is required by and for the sake of some end which it would be unreasonable not to judge desirable and pursuit-worthy. Rather, obligation and law are defined by Hobbes and then by Locke and Pufendorf as matters of superior will. No law without a legislator, no obligation without a subjection to the will of a superior power. Law's formal definition is the declaration of a superior will. The rule of our action is the will of a superior power. These definitions and axioms are meant by these founders of modern natural law theory as to be as applicable to natural law as the very principles of morality, as to the positive law of the states. So the obligation is being openly deducted from fact, and the fact that such and such has been willed by a superior. To be sure, when natural law, i.e. morality, is at an issue, the superior God is assumed to be wise. But the idea of divine wisdom is giving no positive role in explaining why God's commands create obligations for a rational conscience. God's right to legislate is explained instead by the analogy of sheer power. For who will deny that the clay is subject to the potter's will and that the pot can be destroyed by the same hand that shaped it? Like Hobbes, it's uneasily, though dimly aware that the ought cannot be inferred from is without some further ought. And that is to say that he's uneasily aware that the fact that conduct is willed by a superior or indeed by a party to a contract, and it does not explain why the conduct is now obligatory or indeed can ever be obligatory at all. So he sometimes thinks of supplementing his naked voluntarism, and it goes on to say that oughts are explained by acts of will, by the rationality of logical coherence. Fundamental moral principles are tautologies. Tautologies is like different things that are the same thing, or different things that are, different things that mean the same thing, that explain in a different way. But yeah, the norms which it would be self-contradictory to deny. Hobbes had ventured a similar account of the obligatorianess of his fundamental social contract. His fundamental social contract of subjection to the sovereign. His official and prominent explanation was of the form: clubs are trumps, the superior will, power, and force. But for anyone unimpressed by the naked assimilation of right, with might and aught with is, he offers another explanation, and it is self-contradictory not to keep a promise one is made. And then I got some side notes right here. What this obligation explaining end is, in the last analysis, is considered in section 7 below, e.g. Pufendorf elements. For if you have removed God from the function of administering justice, all the efficacy of pacts to the observance of which one of the contracting parties is not able to compel the other by force, it will immediately expire, and everyone will measure justice by his own particular advantage. And assuredly, and if we are willing to confess the truth, once the fear of divine vengeance has been removed, there appears no sufficient reason why I should be at all obligated, after the conditions governing my advantage have once changed, to furnish that thing for the furnishing to the second party I have bound myself while my interest is led in that direction. That is, of course, if I have to fear no real evil, at least from any man, in the consequence of that act. Hey, that's some cold shit I just read. I'm gonna read it again. Did you hear that shit? For if you removed God from the function of administering justice, all the efficacy of pacts, to the observance of which one of the contracted parties is not able to compel the other by force, it will immediately expire, and everyone will measure justice by his own particular advantage. And assuredly, if we are willing to confess the truth, once the fear of divine vengeance has been removed, there appears no sufficient reason why I should be at all obligated, after the conditions of governing my advantage have once changed, to furnish that thing for the furnishing of the second party I have bound myself with interest led in that direction. That is, of course, if I have no fear of real evil, at least from any man, in consequence of that. Meaning that motherfuckers will use you as long as it serve them. And as soon as it don't, fuck you. Die slow. But that's terrible and self-solidifying or solidifying, or whatever the fuck that word was, however you say it. And fucking terrible, okay? That's all I'm gonna say. Ew. You know? But